He woke before the rooster, before the first color lifted itself from the cane fields, and listened for the dogs. The kennels breathed like a single animal, a low thrum of sleep and chain and the sigh of cedar shavings. Rule lay on his pallet in the dim loft above the smokehouse and counted those breaths the way a riverman counts bends. 1, 2, 3. He could tell which hound had the bone dreams, which whined softly when the moon drifted behind cloud. He sat up when the softest whimper came, a pup named Wishbone who fretted in her sleep and knew the night was done. He reached for his shirt, already stiff with a day's work. He laced his boots by feel and stood, light on the boards, light as he could be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. The yard below lay silvered with dew. The pines at the edge of Barker's 100 kept their counsel, and the big house still slept. In that space, Rule had always found a narrow mercy, a few whispered minutes in which the world forgot him. It was enough time to make himself a person again. He descended the ladder, each rung worn smooth by tobacco glue and time, and eased past the iron pot where ash lay dead and gray. In the half-light, his hands knew the buckets, knew the scoop for cornmeal, the bent tin for lard, the little knot of dried sage he kept tucked inside a crack in the post to sweeten the breath of old hounds with the gum disease. He crossed the yard toward the kennel run, where the fences stood taller than a man and the doors were iron-throated. The locks there were the kind a child can't imagine and a poor man never owns, all brass throats and greedy mouths, each a small kingdom. He'd come to know those locks the way a scribe knows letters, by the way they resist and then relent, the curled tongues inside, the feel in his wrist when the bolt went all the way home. On some mornings, he believed the locks knew him back. Rule fed the dogs in a strict pattern that had not been taught to him by any white hand, but by hunger and the desire to keep order in a place without it. Big dogs first, the ones who would bully the smaller ones if he slipped, then the middle rank, then the timid ones. He had learned where to stand and how to turn, how to keep his body between two jealous noses. He learned the quieting touch that can tell a creature you are not its enemy, not today. He spoke no words while he worked, only the small clicks of his tongue, shh, shh, and the occasional breath of a name. Wishbone's bowl he slid closer to the corner where she felt braver. Old Mercy, who whirred her paw when it rained, he scratched gently along the earfold and murmured, "There now." Black Tom, all shoulders and pride, he let stand a moment and look at him, man to beast, before lowering the food. The dog, satisfied, allowed such ceremony. The light began to rinse the edge of the world, and Rule felt it on his neck. Beyond the fence, the fields were a geometry of work already waiting. Hoes leaned. Lashes slept where they were hung. Rule set the last bowl and straightened. His chest had grown round in the last year with the hauling and stooping, but it was not the body that made other men look twice at him. It was the attention he carried. He held his attention the way a miser holds a gold coin, palm closed, always counting. He kept a ledger in his mind, which dog limped which day, which bucket sprang a leak, which nail lifted itself from oak plank after a stretch of wet. Attention, he believed, was the only tool no one could take from him. He was not born to dogs. He'd been sold from the river to the pine country when he was 17, his hands smelling of tar and the rope burn still new. Men who keep boats do not always keep dogs. They keep weather instead. On the river he had learned to read currents and the faces of men who lied, neither of which care for letters. But on the Pine Road East, when the wagon stopped at Barker's 100 and he was traded for a pair of mules and a barrel of nails, the overseer asked one question, "You ever feed hounds?" Rule had said yes, because survival sometimes, at first, is just the shape of a word. And he learned. A year passed, then another. He learned every dog's ways and every man's temper. He learned which boy guard fell asleep with his mouth open and which one liked to sing the rude hymns and watch the moon. He learned that the master loved his hunters like family, but spent no such love on the men who bred them or the men who were chased by them when their feet found courage. He learned that dogs are not to blame for the purposes to which they're turned. He also learned letters.
It happened in stealing glances the way men steal bread when they are still proud, with shame at first, and then with an ache that blots out the shame. The master's youngest boy, Simon, left books everywhere, a trail of linen paper and idle ink. Rule took to sweeping the back porch on purpose when the boy's tutor finished for the morning, collecting the chalk dust and counting his strokes. And when the others' backs were turned, he would set the broom aside and stare at a page. O looked like a hound's mouth when it yawned. S curled like a sleeping tail. Rule would drag his finger along the line and whisper the sounds a breath at a time. The ledger in the kennel office became his teacher too. Names of bitches and sires, dates of whelping, weights measured on the old scale with the brass arm and the hunched crow that served as counterweight. He learned the letters of dogs before he learned the letters of men. There were nights after the men had finished telling the day its cruel jokes and gone to their beds where the straw kept secrets, when Rule would lift a page and hold it to the candle flame. He dared not take a book. He knew men who'd had fingers broken for the theft of a nail. But the light that ran through the paper and brought the ink alive felt like a private sacrament. Auntie Gela, who kept herbs in brown bottles and the babies quiet in their first nights, caught him once with the ledger half open and the world written on it. She said nothing. She only turned her body so the doorway hid him and stood there until the sound of boots had passed. In the dark after, she pressed a sprig of rosemary into his palm. For memory, she said. With memory came a different kind of hunger. It was like eating and finding the food had a shadow that satisfied better than the meat itself. He took to carving letters where no eye would think to look. The inside face of a kennel post, down low, hidden by the rim of the water pan. The undercut of the feed table where the wood had a mouthful of nails. The small square of plank behind the scale where the hinges squealed and no one opened for fear of the sound. At first, he made the letters of the dogs' names, Mercy, Tom, Wish. Then other words that stood up in him like people who won't sit, words like Free and North that he dared to write only as initials, F, N. The day that turned the hunger into a plan began in heat. A late summer thickness pressed the pine needles into quiet and kept the insects high. The men came back from the field with shirts like dishcloths, and the mistress stood on the gallery with a fan that moved the air for no one but her. The overseer, Price, rode up with a smear of dust along his jaw and the look on his face that meant trouble would need a place to land. He dismounted slow, as if the horse were old and he was a mercy to it, and that gesture fooled nobody. Dog in the North Run got loose. Who opened him? Rule had heard nothing. He arranged his face into the shape of simple work. He said, "No dog loose here, steady." Price looked at him in the way you look at an axe to see if the edge is true. "Not here," he said, "out by the swamp edge. Took the scent off a woman's dress and wouldn't let go, had to be beat off. You hear me?" "I hear you," Rule said, and lowered his eyes in a way that looked like submission because the world had rules about the angles of a man's chin. That night, when the light went out of the sky and the grigs began their iron song, Rule walked the fence line twice. Every gate was shut, every latch slept correctly in its hasp. Wishbone had a burr in her paw that he picked with a nail in his breath. He let himself stand long in the square patch of yard where the smell of pine pitch and river mud braided together and made the nose remember two lives at once. A woman, that's what Price had said. Rule thought of the women in the quarters, Letty with her bad knee, Ari with the thumb that never healed right after the gin caught it, and his stomach burned in a way that could have been rage or could have been a prayer someone forgot to tell him how to finish.
He slept badly. He dreamed of letters running like dogs and dogs speaking with men's voices while men howled wordless and afraid. At dawn, he rose and fed and scrubbed the troughs and swept the run. He kept his hands moving while his mind reeled through itself like a spool. If a dog had gone out, how? There were 6 gates along the run, and each had a lock, and the keys hung inside the office on a ring that stayed in a drawer that stayed closed with a little brass turn like a lid on a jar. Rule had a copy of that key and bread. He had made it one winter night with the dough Auntie Gella sent him to knead. He'd slid the key into the pale mass and pressed, then pulled it back and fired the loaf in the oven. The imprint baked into the belly of the bread, and when he broke it open in the snow-laced noon, he memorized the shape, the valleys and peaks, the small bite one tooth took out of the world. He could make a copy in soft tin if he could get enough heat and hide the shine of it after. He knew in his bones that a man who wanted to be free must learn to shape the mouth that says open. He measured the locks with his eyes the way he measured the dog's rib cages with his hands. He studied the screws that held the hasps and noted which had rust budding in the slit. He kept a small file wrapped in cloth beneath a loose brick behind the kennels, and every so often he would pull it out and worry at a nail until the red dust gathered in his palm like patience. No one noticed a man whose job was to tend, and if they did, they mistook skill for nature and thought no more of it. The plan did not arrive all at once. It grew like something planted by accident, then tended because it decided on its own to live. A Tuesday afternoon, when the wagon rattled away and the overseer dozed under the pecan tree, Rule scratched little lines in the dirt behind the kennels where no foot would scuff them. He drew a map, not of the whole plantation, only of his part. The run of the fence, the path to the cane, the ditch that led toward the low ground where the river liked to forget itself after a rain. He put little marks where shade held on longest. He put X's for eyes, who was likely to be looking and when. He did not think himself a general. He thought himself a man with a broom and a file and enough sorrow to carry a thought the long way. He began to carry messages in his head. No paper, no ink. Words that passed like water from one mouth to another when the time was right. At moon's dark, he said, as if speaking of planting. Come thirsty, he said, as if speaking of stew. He never spoke of the dogs to anyone except Auntie Gella, and then only to say, "They don't know the names they're called for." She nodded. "No creature ought be made to forget its own name," she said. Autumn came in on a mule's back, slow, resident with the habit of work. The cane grew heavy in its skirts. Men began to walk with that step that says, "I count the days by the ache in my spine." Rule ran his hands down Mercy's ribs and felt the old dog's heart count slower than summer. He cleaned the water pans with a sternness that felt like prayer. He began to teach the hounds a new thing, the taste of North. He did it with the least of tools. A rag stolen from the wash, dragged along the edges of the fence posts that faced away from the quarters. A sliver of jerky placed just beyond where a dog would think to search, tucked down along the shadowed side of the plank where the light wasn't lovely. He rewarded the nose that turned away from the quarters and toward the low pine and swamp. He whispered their names and sent them where no one sent them. He made a line in the earth with his heel and did not cross it, so they would learn the edge and learn to cross it without him.
The first time he saw a dog find one of those slivers of meat, he had to clasp his fingers together to keep them from flying up. Wishbone, brave today, sniffed and then slid her nose along the fence in the way of a clever child whose teachers underestimate her. She found it in the seam, jerked back as if the fence had bit her, then licked, then nibbled, then wagged with an embarrassment that made Ruel's throat ache. It is possible to love creatures you must betray. He taught himself to make knots he could release in the dark by touch alone. He learned the language of hinges. He trained his face to look like patience when it was rage. He watched the sky and counted nights, whispering to the moon the way a captive whispers to the river in dreams. Not yet. Not yet. Now. The day the letter arrived was the day his plan put down a root he had not planted. The master, whose appetite for the chase had lately outgrown his appetite for anything else, received a letter with blue ink and a city seal. "There's talk of patrols tightening," the master said idly to Price on the porch. "Too many runaways along the parish line. We'll help. We'll bring the dogs." He said it like a man offering to lend a shovel to a neighbor. Ruel, sweeping, learned the whole thing because men speak around him as if he were a doorpost or dust. He slept that night with his palms open as if they could catch a promise falling. The dark of the moon came like the breath before a song. It settled itself. It waited. Ruel walked the run and loosened the first screw in the first hasp, half a turn only, enough so that a good shove would open what a key had once made necessary. He left the second tight, to make the first look inevitable. He brushed the dogs, slow. He told Mercy, "You will go to the pine and find the scent of your own life." He told Black Tom, "Be king somewhere no man can see you." He told Wishbone nothing. He could not trust his voice. The day before the patrol, there was a breaking in the air like old ice. The weather cracked and men felt it in their shoulders. The sky wore gray and the trees became instruments. Ruel took it as a sign that the world might make a cover for him if he moved when it was busy with its own noise. He set out old grease rags in the shed and rubbed them along the hinges at the edges of the run so that those would open like secrets, while he left the nearer ones dry and squeal loud in case a man tumbled to the difference. He ironed his face flat and did his work and wanted nothing from the day but its end. Aunt Jella came to the kennels at mid-afternoon with a bowl of sorghum in her hand and a gaze that read him like a ledger. She stood long enough for no one to wonder, and then longer, so that someone would. It is a way to make attention break, to make a thing boring until a man's eyes slide off it like water. When at last they were alone, she said, "The river's high. That good for you?" "Good for me," he said. She nodded. "They'll look for straight feet and firm ground. You send them crooked." "I will," he said, and could not say more because the ache in his throat had become a plank across a flood. He made a last walk at sundown, pretending to count nails. He tucked the file back in its slot and brushed his palms clean. When the bell rang for the men to return to the quarters, he went with them as he always did, slow, both part of and apart from the drifting. Letty's boy chased a moth with his palms cupped as if he could keep the light. Men spoke of weather and women spoke of aches, and a baby somewhere wailed as the night took measure of itself.
In the cabin, Ruel sat with his back to the corner and held his knees and breathed through his mouth so he would not smell the fear in the room and make it react like quicklime. He thought of the first time he had shaped bread around a key and how the imprint had looked like a riverbed. He thought of Auntie Jella's rosemary on his tongue when he needed to remember. He thought of letters, N for North, F for Free, K for Kennel, G for Gate, O for Open. The alphabet is a rope if you pull it right. When the last of the house lights put its little square on the grass and then went out, when the guard who sang rude hymns yawned so wide Ruel could see the gaps in his teeth, when the first insect made the sound that means midnight is not far, Ruel stood. The path from the quarters to the kennels at night had always felt to him like the inside of a throat. The pines leaned in and spoke in their language of resin. The ground had hollows where rain collects and then goes away with a memory. He walked like a man who belonged to the dark. He carried no lamp. He did not let his boots choose their own sound. He moved through the mouth of the world and did not touch its teeth. The fence he stood and let his breathing slow so that his hands would not shake, because the hands of a man about to change his life will try to ruin him if he lets them. He slid his fingers along the grain of the first gatepost and found the nail-head that watched the yard like an unblinking eye. He pressed it. It turned a hair because he had rusted it to that purpose. He put his shoulder to the gate. The first squeal he answered with his throat, low and long, shh, like water under boards. The dogs rose as one body and then sat, confused, because this door opens only at dawn, and this is not dawn, and yet it is him, and he is the shape of food and kindness, and so they waited. "Mercy," he whispered.
He opened her door. He let his hand walk down her back the way the son used to when she was a pup. He guided her to the gap he had made between fence and run, where the rag smelled of pine and something far. She hesitated, because dogs are loyal to walls when walls are their world. He pressed his forehead to hers. "Go," he said, not with his voice but with everything else he had. She went. 1 gate. 2. 3. It is possible to get used to doing the impossible when the night agrees with you. He moved as if he were writing, and each hinge was a letter. He did not look up when a cloud broke and the moon showed its bone. He did not count. Counting would make him human, and humans tremble. He became emotion. Wishbone came last because love is what we all save for the end when we think there is no end. She trembled, and he kissed the top of her head, a sin that could cost a man his teeth. "You go be somebody's good girl under no man's whip," he said, not caring if the world heard him, because the world loves to be told it is important, but it understands nothing about a man's last word to a dog. She went too, a small pale thing into the tall dark grass, and then the yard was a different place. It had more air in it. It had silence where sound had been born every day like work. Ruel stood inside that silence and let it tell him what to do next. The office, the key ring in the drawer with the little brass twist. He went inside. He stood a moment because the smell of ink and oil and the ghost of the master's tobacco make the lungs behave like scolded children. He opened the drawer. The keys lay coiled like snakes who believe they own the room. He took them, and he took the ledger, and he opened it to the page where it said the dog's names like scripture, and he put a finger on each name and said, "You are free of the work they used you for." Then he placed the ledger back exactly as it had been, because men feel the change of dust. He stepped out into the yard, and the yard well knew that something had changed in it. Change has a smell. It smells like cold iron and rain about to begin. He moved along the outer fence, a shadow where shadow expects itself. He opened the run that led toward the pines. He left the gate that faced the quarters closed and loud. He loosened the last hinge that would protest, and then let it sing a little so that if a man was to wake at all, he would think that was the problem and go there. Somewhere beyond the first trees, a hound bawled, long and low. The sound not of a hunter, but of a creature who has found out that the world is bigger than the story it was born into. Ruel felt his knees go weak with joy, so quiet it could have been grief.
He turned to the last gate, the one no one bothered because it hung crooked and took 2 men to set right every spring. He had worked at its bolts for weeks, breathing rust until the taste of it became part of bread. He set his shoulder to it, and the wood answered him with a sound like a barn settling. He lifted. He turned. The bolt moved inside its throat. "Who's there?" His name was a noise pulling down out of the night. Not his given name. No one used that but the few who loved him, but the name the guard shouted when he wanted to stop the world. "Boy!" the voice said. "Who's there?" Rule let the gate rest. The sound had come from the direction of the smokehouse. He could picture the guard, boots unlaced, rifle in his hands, hat off because the night had hands to steal it. He could picture the way fear makes a man stomp when he should listen. He stayed still. Stillness in a man can be a weapon when noise is a man's habit. The guard walked toward the loud hinge he had left purposely dry, and when it squealed, the guard swore and set his attention there. "Damn fool dogs," the guard said, and Rule almost laughed because the dogs were smarter than the night understood. He slid his file under the edge of the last bolt and turned it a hair more. The metal spoke in its tiny voice, "Tick," and he knew no human ear, afraid and angry, could have heard it at that distance. He felt the weight of the gate like the weight of a word he had held too long behind his teeth. He lifted again.
A light flared at the corner of the yard, the overseer's lantern. Rule recognized the color of it. Price kept his wick trimmed too low, and the flame burned sullen. One set of footsteps. Two. The men spoke in a murmur that could have been wind if wind had contempt in it. "Thought I heard something," the guard said. "Gate," Price said. "That bad hinge." Rule did what you do when the river rises and you still have to cross. He chose his step and took it, knowing a foot wrong would take him and everything with him. He lifted the gate fully now and leaned his body against it so the wood would not kiss the post and tell the world it had moved. He held his breath until the pain in his chest became a bell. The lantern came closer. The men stood at the wrong gate, the loud one. Price put his hand on it and shook. It protested like a fiddle out of tune. "You did," Price said. "You never do a thing when I say it." That was when the lemon of lightning split the trees and the thunder rolled over their words like a wheel. The lantern bucked. A spit of rain blew through the yard full of the smell of distant water. The men swore and lifted their collars and turned their faces to the main house where the porch roof was. Rain is an accomplice if you ask it right. Rule asked it nothing. He just moved with it. He eased the gate open and let the dark water in. He gestured with his hands the way he had taught the dogs to understand his meaning when his voice would only betray them. He mouthed the last yes in a life of no. From the quarters a baby cried, not the hungry cry, but the alarmed one. A mother shushed. Somewhere near the smokehouse a pig knocked into its pen and made the sound of a man bumping his head. The world stayed itself, and inside it a small revolution unfolded like a letter from a friend. Rule reached for the last latch. It was stiff with the stubbornness of old iron. He wondered if perhaps the world was reminding him that there are always last latches, always one more thing that believes it is necessary. He put his palm against the metal and remembered the shape of the key he had made out of bread, the little bite one tooth took out of the world. He smiled. And in that smile the boy from the river stood up inside the man who had fed dogs for years. The thunder came again, closer. The lantern lights swung back because men are curious even when they're cold and mad. Price cursed the weather, and the guard laughed in a way that meant he was afraid. Rule eased his shoulder deeper under the gate and set his fingers to the bolt and felt it answer him through time and plank and intention. The bolt moved. The gate shifted. He heard in his own ribs a sound that might have been joy or might have been terror. He thought of Auntie Gella's steady breath, of Letty's bad knee stepping for the first time, not because someone told it to, but because it wanted to. He thought of letters notched under tables and the shape of N like a path up and down and up again. Then the lantern burned brighter. He saw it through the rain as if the flame had decided to tell on him. Price had lifted the little glass and turned the wick, and now the yard wore a stranger's face. "What's that?" the guard said. And for the first time, his voice had the sound of a man asking an honest question. Rule pressed. The latch gave a fraction. He heard the hinge behind his hip whisper the beginning of a squeal. He knew that with one more breath, one more motion, he could make a door out of a wall and a road out of a prison. He took the breath. He made the motion. He felt the world tilt toward a shape it had not taken in years. The lantern swung toward him. The rain sharpened. The sound of a hound from the deep trees, that long, astonished note again, came like a benediction. Rule set his teeth against the fear that wanted to ruin his hands, and he turned the latch. turning.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Turning the iron into something that remembered water instead of rust. The latch slid at last. The gate opened enough for a man to pass sideways, enough for a night to change its mind. Rain crossed the yard in cords. It hissed off the shingles and stitched the ground to the sky. Rule slipped through, drew the gate back to its near closed, and left it so the yard thought it had dreamed the sound. He went along the fence line, a shadow among old shadows, and eased the outer catch until it would only pretend to hold. Then he stopped. The decision had lived inside him for months. Now it put on a face. When the dogs ran, men would run too. Out of houses, towards saddles, with rifles bucking their shoulders and mouths full of orders. If he was to give his people a sliver of time, the yard needed another story to tell itself. Rule bent, gathered a handful of damp earth, and slapped it against the office door like a dirty hand. He smeared more along the porch post, the height of a man's shoulder. He took the old grease rag and drew a line from the door toward the cane and then cut it hard toward the swamp where boot prints die. He moved again, swift and precise, and pulled the kennel ledger half an inch askew. Price would see it and think of theft, and thinking of theft, he would think of men, not dogs. He dropped the key ring into the ash bucket so someone would taste soot before they tasted blame. Then he returned to the last gate, placed his palm on the wet wood like a blessing, and stepped away from his old life. The first shout came thin through rain. The second carried iron. Lanterns sprang and lurched, the yard filled with the panicked intelligence of weather and men together. Rule was already between the smokehouse and the pots, moving toward the line of pines where the fence broke itself around roots. He slid through the gap he had left for himself a week prior, a slat cut half through, a nail bent back like a finger, and crouched in the ditch, chest in mud, breath counting thunder. Dogs called from the trees, not in the clipped barks of a chase, but in the astonished canticles of creatures who have discovered their own noses belong to them. Rule heard Mercy, recognized the reach of her voice the way a father recognizes his child in a crowd. He heard Black Tom's bray flatten and stretch, a rope thrown long into dark. He felt the weight of names lift off his shoulders and float out into rain and pine. Boots thudded. Metal rattled. "Gate's been crowned open," the guard hollered. "Ledger's touched," Price answered, and Rule tasted the word ledger in the overseer's mouth as if it were a fishbone. "Which one?" the master's voice, sleepy and insulted. "All," Price said. "Every damn pen." "Then saddle," the master said, and the bell in his voice shook the sleeping out of men who had wanted sleep no more than Rule had wanted chains. Rule crawled the ditch until the ditch forgot to be a ditch and became a runnel of water obedient to gravity alone. The pines deepened. His ears found the language of the storm and began to use it. He emerged in the low ground where the earth stank of life, rich rot, leaf blood, the cold coin smell of iron in sucking clay. He kept his hands out against the wet to learn the invisible, the way he'd learned the kennel in dark. He had told no one the exact night. He had told the moon, and he had told the dogs, and he had told his own ribs, which needed the count. But the men and women knew something was coming because the air had been walking around big lately, and because Auntie Jella's hands had been busy the way a weather woman's hands are when she feels a pressure change in her bones. If anyone else moved this night, it would be because their own decisions had come of age. He reached the place where he had pegged a length of rope under a pine's exposed root. He drew it free. On one end hung a pouch with 3 things: a stub of tallow, a key that he had filed from memory, and a roll of gray cloth with a packet of dried rosemary stitched inside the seam. He kept the key,
He left the rosemary. He rubbed his fingers along the oilcloth to make the smell move through his hands and up into his head. He said, "Remember, remember." From upriver a horn wailed, the patrol's bugle careless and eager. Rule studied the sound. He pictured the road. He pictured the men who rode with their hats low and their collars turned and their musket flints kept dry in goatskin. He pictured the way the river throws voice where it pleases, making a man think danger's to the right when it's to his left, or behind when it's before. He stepped into the brush and crouched still while 3 riders pounded past on the plantation road, shouting at shadows, convinced they were chasing a man. He did not think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as accurate.
The first place he went was not the quarters. It was the horse lot. He moved along the fence where ragweed blurred a man's outline and slipped between 2 rails at the low spot where the ground had sagged after last winter's flooded January. The horses rolled their eyes white at Funder, but trusted the fence more than their instinct. They stayed. Rule slid to the tack shed. The padlock there was kin to the kennel locks. He blessed the rain again. He pressed the soft tin key to it, felt for the bite, turned. It resisted in the old way of men who like to resist. Then it gave. Inside, leather steamed in its own smell and metal told small truths. Rule took 3 halters and 1 saddle, a coil of rope, a rust-licked currycomb, a sack half full of corn. He carried them to the low fence and set them where a hand would find them without a thought. Then he went to the far corner and lifted the latch. He hissed between his teeth in the rhythm he had taught the dogs, a rhythm of calm, not hurry. The youngest mare, a dun with a dorsal line like a pencil mark, lifted her head and then, because the rain made the world a little strange, stepped forward to meet the strangeness. He let her sniff his blown sleeve. He moved near and put the halter on in a single clean motion that said, "We have never done this before, but we have always known how." He looped a second halter around a gelding who had been kind to boys and cruel to men. He tied the rope easy so it would be easy to untie. "Hey!" a voice from the yard. "Who's at the horses?" Rule slapped the dun's flank, and she shot through the open, pulling the rope and the second horse after, out into rain thick as chain. He stepped backward into shadow, and the voice focused upon hooves, not man. "Loose!" it shouted, and soon there were 2 men, and then 3, running with their hats in their hands, as if the hats had decided to lead, and the men could do nothing but follow. With the horse lot in uproar and the kennels emptying into pine, Rule bent his path toward the quarters at last. He kept to water where he could. He learned each puddle's temperament in a step. The shallow ones clucked, the deep ones whispered, and gave himself to the night's study. He hummed a river tune without voice, a vibration in his bones. The tune was nothing a person could hear and everything a body could obey. The quarters were a hive in rain. Doors squawked, babies wrung the air. Some men held their families still, as people do when they sense any motion will be counted against them. Others moved toward the tree line with packs that were not packs yet, blankets tied wrong, food wrapped in aprons, decisions pronounced too late but pronounced anyway. Rule stepped into a doorway and met Letty's eyes. They had the sheen of animal eyes when the fire's behind you. "They out?" she asked. "They out," he said. Her mouth trembled in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Then go," she said. "Go and pull the night in after you so it can't be shut." "I'm going," he said. And then, because this was the only time and the only woman in the world he could ask, "Can you walk?" She lifted her chin at the leg that had hurt her for 5 years. "Tonight I can," she said. Auntie Jella stood in her door with a jar under her elbow and a bundle like a baby on her hip, though the child she'd delivered that afternoon was asleep behind her. The rain slicked her face and the lines on it looked like written things. The river will take a man if he won't take it, but it will hold him if he knows how to float where the dead logs float. Low, sideways to the push. You remember." "I remember," he said. He reached and she placed the jar in his hand. Inside, something gray moved like broken weather. "What is it?" she asked. "Night in a bottle," she said, and smiled for the first time in a year. Ash and grease and lampblack. A man can paint his face with it and the white of him goes small. He did as she'd taught boys to do for coon hunts, dabbed 2 fingers, striped his cheekbones, darkened his throat. He dipped again and brushed his palms, then pressed them once to the lintel above her door, leaving prints like signatures. "For memory," he said.
"For memory," she returned. Rule slipped again into rain. The patrol horn called from the road, nearer. A different horn answered from the lower parish. Men shouted about horses. Another voice cursed dogs. The plantation was a mouthful of noise. Rule went silent into it the way water goes silent when it deepens. He crossed the backfield by its shallowest diagonal so that any eye from the big house would have to choose between lightning and man, and would choose lightning because it loves itself. He slid through cane that rattled with the nervous joy of being hit by rain hard enough to remember storms from when the earth was new. He reached the ditch he had drawn on his dirt map and stepped down into it and let it carry him like grocery to table. Where the ditch turned its shoulder to the swamp, 2 figures waited. He knew them by the shapes of their patience. "Rue," one breathed. "Everston," he answered. The man had been called Ari since he was a boy, but in a storm you call a man the full length of his name so that it can catch him if he slips. "You sure?" Ari's hand tightened on his bundle. "I'd be sure if it was only me. It's her," he said, tipping his head toward the shadow at his elbow. Ruth, with the thumb mangled by the gin, stood a step behind, her body already bent toward the future as if it had gravity. "You put those dogs in the world," she said to Rule. "I said if God made a night for such, it would be in rain." "It is," Rule said. "We go now. The patrol's ahead. We aim behind their eyes." He led them along the ditch until it dissolved into the flat, and then through the hackberry stand where lightning could not reach for the tangle. He showed them where to place their weight on the hummocks. He taught as he moved. "Heel to toe in mud," he said. "Step in water where you can. Water forgets first." He handed Ruth the second halter from around his neck and looped it across her waist. "If one of us sinks, pull slow, not hard." They went without speech until the world smelled less of cane and more of sour swamp, and the trees changed their names. The hound sounded miles away, then nearer, then gone again, the way a man's mind does when it wants to ruin him. Once, a howling lion ran parallel to them, too close. Rule crouched and put his palm to the earth as if feeling a sleeping child's fever. He felt the vibration before the sound, the small churning of water where paws made question marks. He whispered to his own bones the command he had hushed into ears for years. "Down, stay." Wishbone's shape ghosted through cypress knees at 20 paces, nose down, tail level, doing the work she was born to do. Rule's heart ran across the past and fetched it back so he could carry it 1 more mile. He watched as her nose lifted, puzzled. No handler, no hand. The rain poured its confusion through her and washed it out. She angled away, took the push of weather, and disappeared into a mile of nobody's property. He let himself breathe again. Behind them a shot cracked. Not near, not for them. Men wasting powder at shapes. They reached the first marker he had set months ago. A dead pine snag that lightning had worried 12 summers past. Now a spear thrust out of muck. He had wedged a sliver of brass in its split, a bit of the scale weight, so that even in black you could find it with a searching thumb. He touched it, then put Ruth's hand to it, then Ari's, so their fingers could learn what map looks like when map is made of faith and metal. 2 more like this, then the willow, then the river. The second marker was a jawbone of some creature once heavy, lay half buried at the foot of a gum tree. He'd scrubbed it clean of smell months before, then wrapped it in beeswax and river mud and left it to take the flavor of everything and nothing. He brushed mud so they would see the white in the next lick of sky. If we're followed, he said, remember this, do not touch the white. Let it be a lie for the men who think they can read sign. The last marker was sound, not thing, the high false note of the gray tree frogs that sing when water climbs the bank and thinks about going farther. Hear that? Rule breathed. It means we quit land soon. They came to the willum. In flood it took its leaves like a skirt and danced. Tonight it hunched. Beneath it lay the skiff. He had stolen it piece by piece. A plank that once served as a hog ramp, planed twice and left in sun to forget its pig. A rib bent with steam from the wash kettle when Auntie Jella lifted her lid and filled the yard with fog. Nails paid for with nights of back and one soft word at the right time. He had assembled it in a bend of the slough where men did not go because mosquitoes like to keep their own company. He had sealed its seams with pitch, scabbed from the pines, and he had whispered a promise into its bough, the way a man whispers a name into a child's ear. Get in, he said. Kneel low and put your hands on the ribs. Don't grip, lay 'em.
Ruth stepped like a woman into church, careful and reverent. Ari followed with the bundle. Ruel pushed off with the willow root and anchored the oar against the mud and did not pull hard, only let the river take it, as if it had won an argument and he was the loser who knew how to live long anyway. Water takes a man's heat so fast he can forget he has any left. The rain yelled less here because the trees hoarded some of it, and the river took the rest into itself with the gratefulness of a thing used to being hit. Ruel set the oar feathers flat and made little corrections. He kept the skiff angled not toward the far bank, but downstream of it. There's no straight path across a running thing, not if you intend to keep what you carry. He listened more than he looked. The swamp speaks in clicks and hushes. The river speaks in long vowels. The sky pounded consonants. Between the three languages, a man can learn everything he needs if he has already almost died once and would prefer not to do it again. Halfway across, the horn sounded nearer now from just above the big house. Another horn answered from downriver, and this one belonged to men who liked to drink together at a certain ferry. Ruel let the skiff settle into the belly of the current and watched two lanterns breathe toward one another on the far bank. He counted to 60 in a voice that had no air, and then to 60 more. The lanterns met like gulls and then moved off, one up, one down, leaving a stretch of night between them. Ruel eased the blade, and the skiff obeyed. On the far bank, mud welcomed them with the quiet laugh of a drunk aunt. They slid into cane gone wild, not good cane, the kind men plant and pride themselves on, but the rough stuff, sour sweet, grown where it should not. Ruel tipped the skiff so it took mud, then shifted it into the leak of a side channel and left it half hidden under vines. He rubbed the oar and the gunwales with muck to end any shine. He took the soft tin key from his pouch and drove it into the joint of a stump, because you always pay a crossing with something you might need later. Now? Ari asked. Now we go crooked, Ruel said, and put his body toward the pines again, rib deep in the work of breathing and listening and choosing between two bads and one worse. On the ridge, Thunder's hand grew weaker. The rain thinned into long strings hung from leaf to leaf. In that lesser sound, they heard voices. Men worked the road. Spurs talked to stirrups. Once, a laugh lifted and drifted as if it liked being itself more than it liked any joke. Ruel led them not along, not away, but into a stand of reed he had scouted, where the ground rose in little islands. There he sank to his thighs and then to his chest, and then he stopped and did not move. Ruth copied him because she had long ago learned that work is often the art of copying a good thing.
Ari stood one heartbeat too long in pride, and then he too went into water. Hounds found their place on the road above. Men talked about sign. Someone said they went this way because men love to believe the world leaves its story for them. Ruel pressed his lips together and let the day's earlier rosemary rise from his fingertips. He touched the mud under the waterline, swirled his hand, and let the gray ghost of smell move into the reeds. A dog came down slope, slid, caught itself, complained to no one. It stood 5 yards from Ruel and filled its chest with breath and decided what the world meant. It chose wrong. It threw its voice toward the east fence line, and men followed their own idea. Ruth shook, not from fear, from the cost of being still. Ruel slid his hand to the rope around her waist and pinched, slow and rhythm. Keep. She kept. They waited the long time. Lightning had finished its argument with the hill and now sulked off into distance, muttering. Men's shouts came softer but surer. Above them, somewhere toward the house, a woman screamed. Not fear, a name. Someone else screamed back another name. The plantation's noise was learning itself. When Ruel judged the moment had sagged enough, they rose inch by inch and bled into the next bad place, and then the next, until bad became less bad because distance had done what distance does when a man and a woman and a will make use of it. By morning, the rain had settled into a straight fall. The world looked washed. Birds risked a few foolish notes. Ari's face had become a mask like Ruel's. Not the ritual kind, the tired kind, the kind a man must wear to keep the last of his heat inside. Ruth's hands were raw from cane edges. A mosquito hid under her ear where the rain couldn't find it and fed. She did not lift a hand to it because she had promised herself not to move unless Ruel said move.
Rest, Ruel said, when the road grew soft and sound, and the pines changed their smell to something nearer to home and farther from men. They crouched in the lee of a fallen cypress and took turns with a heel of cornbread Auntie Jella had given by not giving. It had sat on her shelf for the wrong person until the right person needed it. They let the bread soften on their tongues and remembered 100 suppers of not enough. This all? Ari asked, looking toward a future that did not yet exist. No, Ruel said, not all. Men go to ground like rabbits. Rabbits know the map better than dogs. We make ourselves new readers. He looked at his hands. They had swelled with water and labor. He flexed them and felt the heat return the way a far drum returns after fading. At sundown we pushed to the old rail bed. There's a culvert there long as a philosophy. We sleep inside the earth's thought. They slept in turns. Ruel took first watch. He listened to the pine-top talk about wind, to the frog behind his left shoulder but not his right, to the small wrong note that means a snake is in grass. He did not think of the big house, or the overseer, or the boy Simon, or the way cedar shavings stick to wet fur. He thought of letters. He thought of the way O had once looked like a hound yawning, and now looked like a mouth open not in hunger, but in song. He woke Ruth with a touch to her heel. She rose without speech and took his place. He lay himself down not to the earth, but into it, the way you lie into a woman you mean to love a long time, carefully, grateful she has permitted it. He slept and dreamed not of dogs, but of a door that took no key and opened when he looked at it. The day moved, the rain broke, heat returned and made everything smell like it had a skin. They went at dusk as he had said, and when the whippoorwill called twice and then swallowed the third call, they reached the rail bed, a hump in the world leading from nothing to nothing, with all the ties ripped up by men who had needed the wood for winter. The culvert was a mouth of brick. Inside it water talked to itself in a low voice as if it were practicing.
They crawled in and put their backs to the curve and let sound swallow sound. In that hollow, they were not people. They were intention and blood and the small light that keeps both from going out. Ruel taught them the quiet laugh you make with closed lips so your ribs can still remember joy without the air carrying it away. Late in the night, lantern glow flickered at the far end, a candle's worth, then less. Voices. Men had come as far as their pride and their orders allowed and no farther, because the dark under a road belongs to things men don't want to name. The lantern paused, then retreated, and the world in the brick mouth breathed again. At dawn they moved. They crossed the road at a place where cartwheels had bitten it into two and left a third for them. They went into scrub oak and then into sycamores, so old their bark flaked away like lies. They found a shallow spring, sipped, washed their faces in a silence that was not reverent, but necessary. They ate nothing, because the bread was gone, and hunger would keep them moving in a line that had purpose. By afternoon the land rose, not a mountain, no such thing here, but a thought of one. From a small height, Ruel looked back and saw smoke from Barker's 100 trailing a lesson into the sky. He could not read it at this distance, and told himself that was good. They reached the line of a parish road and stopped. Ruel lay down with his ear to it as if it were a body. He felt iron far off. He waited until it passed, wagon or horse with a plate shoe, he couldn't tell which. And then he sent Ari first, then Ruth, then himself, keeping the road as something that existed but did not matter. Toward evening, when the mosquitoes decided the world had been too good, Ruth stumbled. Not badly, not like an ending, but the stumble wrote a note in her ankle, and the note wanted to be read. Ruel turned. "You can stop," he said. "No, it's a child's step. It can be ignored." He respected it anyway. "Give me the bundle. You keep your center." He took from her the little that looked large when she lifted it, and he felt how men have made women carry weight unwitnessed for more years than men can count. He carried it as if it had all their names in it. In a way, it did. They slept that night under a sky that had finally opened its one clear eye. Stars wrote a language Ruel never learned. He wanted to. He whispered each one a letter he knew from Taper, A, O, S, until the sky felt less like something that owned him and more like something that could be spoken to. Sometime toward morning, coyotes sang. The sound made Ari's hands tighten because it wore the coat of mourning. Ruel listened and smiled into the dark. "Hear that?" he murmured. "They say the world is bigger than fences." The next day brought the river again. This time a branch so narrow that the cypress knees made a fence of their own. They wove, patient. A turtle slid in front of them as if it had an appointment elsewhere. A heron stood pretending to be thought. Confusion lifted its hems and went to bother some other men. Toward noon, they found sign of other feet. The print was the size of Ruel's palm, and the edges of it hadn't slumped yet. He crouched and touched just next to it, then lifted his fingers to his nose. Corn and lard faint, not white men, not tonight's runaways either, older, maybe yesterday. He looked up, and the trees answered him by pointing toward a break in the brush that looked like nothing a casual eye would prize. He stood and went that way, slow. The path slid like a rumor. It revealed just enough to keep them. After 200 paces, they smelled smoke in a way that meant kindness. Smoke tells two stories, one about hunger and one about hurt. This one spoke of beans and a woman's hand. The camp lay in the bowl of an old sandbarrow, invisible from the road, invisible from the water unless you knew it was there. Two women sat beside a low fire banked like a secret. A boy, 9 maybe, showed them a frog, and the frog showed him patience.
An old man slept with his mouth open because he had earned the right not to be vigilant every minute of his life for 1 minute. When the women saw him, they did not startle. They weighed him, the way you weigh a sack of meal, useful and maybe heavy, but necessary.
"We've been expected," one of them said, and grinned because she liked the taste of those words. "By who?" Rill asked, smiling back because he wanted to know what sort of world was brave enough to expect anything of him. "By the night," she said, "and by every dog you ever taught to go the other way." Her eyes were clever. "We heard them. They ran like a prayer that forgot to ask permission." They fed them. Beans, as promised, a scrap of salt pork that made the mouth remember 100 sins and forgive them. Cornbread of a different recipe than Auntie Jella's that still knew the same song. They let them sit and not explain themselves. Ruel felt the world widen to include the possibility that sometimes you do not have to pay for every small generosity with a good reason. "Name's Tansy," the clever-eyed woman said, when the edges of hunger had been blunted. "This here's my sister, Maud. That old sleep there is Isaiah. The boy's Hark." She flicked a glance at Ruth. "You're Ruth. And you're Ari. And you're the one with the dogs." "How you know that?" Ari asked before pride could stop him. Tansy thumbed toward the boy. "Hark can track a rabbit through a sermon. He said he smelled cedar and iron and something like sorrow that wasn't his. Only one place got all three." She looked at Ruel. "You opened them." "I opened them," he said, and surprised himself with the calm in it, as if he had said, "I opened the door for rain to come in where the floor needed washing anyway." Tansy nodded like a woman hearing about a birth that took its time. "Then there's other things to open," she said. "We've been about that work a while." So it was that Ruel discovered the road he had made for himself ran alongside a road others had shaped, and sometimes the two roads were one. Tansy and Maud's camp was one of a string that zigzagged parish to parish, rooted not in maps, but in people. A coppersmith 2 bends down who lets you sleep under his shed where the copper kept the mosquitoes guessing. A woman called Vine, because she never went straight, who swapped 3 eggs for news and counted an ear for who had crossed. A man at a sawmill who liked to split more than pine. They did not speak of a north the way children speak of candy. They spoke of a north the way builders speak of load-bearing beams. "We don't send everyone up," Maud said that night, when the men had made a screen of brush and the boy slept with his frog. "Sometimes up kills as sure as down. Sometimes we send sideways, deep into swamps where a patrol won't pay to go except once, and the once scares them off. Sometimes we send inward, onto a back 40 where a poor white lives so poor he ain't got time to mind a body living across his fence." She shrugged. "Freedom's a geography you draw with what you got." Ruel listened. He realized he was not the only one who kept ledgers in the head. He asked, "What do you need?" Because that is the right next question when you find out a world larger than yours exists. Tansy looked at his hands. "Hands like that can make a cut nail into a key. Hands like that can teach a dog to get lost in daylight. Hands like that can carry names quiet." She leaned closer and her voice dropped the weight of every year she had lived. "We need a man who knows how white men look at things they own. We need a man who can put his mind inside a lock and turn it from there." Ruel felt something in him answer that was not pride and not mere usefulness. It was the thing that grows when a person's private hunger finds a table already set for more than one. He stayed 3 days. He mended a skiff's strake for Isaiah with pitch that did not stink up the entire parish because he coaxed it slow. He taught Hark how to lay a line of grease that would draw a hound across a river and leave men cursing boot-sucking mud. He showed Maud how to twist a strip of tin into a coil that would hold a hasp in the illusion of closure while a child's finger could make it fall open. He asked Tansy for names and received only the ones she meant him to carry, which was the kindest thing she could have given him. He gave back one, Auntie Jella. "If you come that way, do not go to her door unless you want company you don't want. Walk past and drop a rosemary twig by the ash barrel. If she sees it, and if she's alone, she will hum a river tune, and then you can turn around." Tansy smiled at how 2 different songs could sound like the same one if you didn't rush.
On the fourth morning, Ruel lifted his eyes toward the tree line and saw 2 points of light moving wrong. Lanterns hunting, not near, not on top of them, but hunting in a way that spoke not of men lost and angry, but of men with orders folded in a pocket. He tapped Tansy's wrist twice. She nodded. The camp emptied itself into an ordinary patch of world in less time than it takes to say go. The pot overturned, the ash brushed, the frog put back in the creek by a boy who didn't cry because he decided not to. Isaiah woke with a curse and then smiled because being roused to safety is the only good way to be roused.
They left separate. Rule, Ruth, and Ari took the slash toward the cypress knees. Tansy and Maud lefted the old path behind them with their feet so it became just brush again. Hark walked in the water like it was a chapel aisle. The lanterns crossed the ridge and kept on, fooled by what they had wanted to find instead of what was there. Beyond that morning lay 2 kinds of days, the ones made of walking and hiding and eating whatever did not mind being eaten, and the ones made of intervention. It was in the second kind that Rule discovered what it means to be not only a man escaping, but a man who is chosen to lead. The first intervention came at a place men called Shingle Ford, where a creek spreads itself thin over flat stone and thinks it is clever. Patrols like it because wheels move easy there, and dogs like it because the scent sticks in the shallow and points the way like a preacher. Rule and Tansy met in the scrub above it with 2 sacks and a thought. "You sure?" she asked. "I've been sure of smaller things," he said. "This deserves it." They went down after moonrise when the guards had left a boy to the task. The boy was brave, the way a boy must be when he is watched by men. He kicked out a frog and looked bored. His boredom was the prayer that saved him. He did not see 2 shadows slip into water above the ford, or the hands that emptied sacks of butcher scraps and lard along the wrong bank, then smudged cornmeal where the patrol's horses liked to stand, then took a strip of cloth from a woman's wash line and tied it to a willow on the side no man used because it looked like too much work. At dawn, when the chase came on again, and the dogs landed on that ford as if it were written into their bones, they hit the flood of the wrongness all at once. Noses flared, tails argued with backs. The lead hound chose lard over logic and turned, and when a lead hound turns, a story turns with it. By noon, the patrol had run themselves in a circle and blamed one another, and finally the boy. "You catch hell," Tansy said, watching from a brush blind that smelled of sassafras. "Hell ain't got dogs," Rule said. "We do. Dogs are death for us." The second intervention came at a tannery, where the owner had taught the sheriff to make boots, and the sheriff paid him back in lenience. A woman had run with a child. She had made good time and good choices, but had been unlucky with a blister that had burst its opinion into the sole of her foot. The men had her cornered in a stump field noon bright. Rule, Ari, and 2 from Tansy's line came up on the far fence and saw it all. The woman standing with the child behind her, and the men choosing their angle like carpenters argue angles. "Straight foolishness to shoot," Ari said. "They won't, not with the owner watching. He wants a lesson, not a death." Rule nodded. He looked at the tannery yard. Hides hung like a choir of ghosts, barrels of lime, a pit, a rack with knives. He looked at the white men's faces. "I'll take the knives," he said. "No blood," Tansy said, reading him. "No blood," he agreed, and slipped along the fence to the shed, quiet as if he was going to fetch a sleeping baby back to bed. He took 2 knives and a rasp and a small bag of bluestone and a handful of scrap leather like flags. In the shadow of the barrels, he rasped the knife edges dull. He rubbed a bluestone into the leather until it looked important. He spoke to the nearest dog where no white ear could hear him. "When I lift my hand, you look at that leather and you forget you were ever taught to care which man you belong to." Then he stepped out where a man could be seen. He did not shout, he did not claim. He simply lifted the leather high and let the wind catch it. Dogs are eyes before they are noses sometimes. 3 heads snapped to the movement thing. One handler cursed and jerked a leash, and the jerk made the dog guess there was something even more interesting over there, past the man with the leather, and in that guessing, the lines crossed, and in that crossing, the woman ran,
child to hip, into the rawhide smell, and through it and out the other side. Rule dropped the leather, stepped back into shadow, and became again a man nobody noticed. They met the woman at night in a stand of willow 2 miles down. She did not hug him, she did not weep. She drank water, wiped her child's mouth, and said, "I thought I'd die learning how to be fast." Rule smiled. "You learned how to live, learning how to be fast." His third intervention cost him. It was an error born of mercy, and men who speak of mercy as if it was always safe have not tried to live by it. They had taken up a way station and a cane brake where a dry hummock could hold 4 bodies and a 5th if everyone agreed to let their bones be neighbors. A boy came into their camp just before dawn with a story about his sister who had been taken through the swamp to the parish jail because she had slapped the master's nephew when the nephew forgot his hands were not his own. "She ain't but 14, the boy said, and Rule tasted iron because numbers make the mind scald. "Jail's too hot to touch," Maud said. "You get caught there and you won't even get to hang. They'll study you a while first." Rule knew it. He also knew the jailer. He had fixed the jailer's latch 3 winters ago when Price had loaned him out for beer. He had left the latch worse, not better, but he knew the shape of his failure. "I go, not to fetch her, that's foolish, but to make a door inside the door." Ari grabbed his sleeve. "You ain't a ghost.